Hey, internets. As it turns out, taxation is theft, and arguments to the contrary tend to range from 10-word-long streamer debate bro 360 no-scope hot takes that, when critically examined, turn out to be a circular argument, to 9,001-word-long essays that engage in lengthy semantical arguments that call upon a plethora of philosophers and scholars throughout the ages, while also citing numerous academic papers and research, then engaging in various mental gymnastics and further navel-gazing and further redefining of words, resulting in a conclusion that, when critically examined, also turns out to be a circular argument, and is therefore not really meaningfully different from the debate bro hot take, other than the fact that it managed to waste more of your time. Funny how that works, isn't it? Now, you may be someone who already agrees that taxation is theft, and you want to get better at explaining to other people why it's theft, or perhaps you're neutral to the idea and you're just here because you're curious, or perhaps you disagree, you don't think it's theft, but perhaps you're open-minded enough to hear why it is. Or maybe you're here because you're just bored out of your mind. Regardless of where you're coming from, everybody should find this interesting, because as it turns out, coming to terms with accepting that there really isn't a good argument against the fact that taxation is theft is a big part of realizing that the crazy lolbarts are in fact correct about the economic problems of society and how it's currently structured to take a lot of things for granted. Which, speaking of taking things for granted, a lot of people take their cybersecurity and privacy on the internet for granted. And so this video is sponsored by private internet access. In my honest opinion, VPNs are absolutely necessary to take advantage of all the internet has to offer in a way that keeps your data safe and secure. Whether it's from hackers trying to steal your passwords and identity, your internet service provider, the prying eyes of the surveillance state, or from copyright trolls seeking to harass you, using the internet without a VPN lets them see everything. It's like going into combat without any armor and just hoping you don't get hit. A generally bad idea. And a VPN solves this and protects your personal data by masking your IP online. And in the case of private internet access, rerouting your traffic through RAM-only servers that have a strict no-logs policy that has been proven in court. Which is just one of the many reasons I've been using them as my go-to VPN for over a year, and I've always been impressed with the features and how well private internet access just works. And it can be used for a lot of things other than just security. For instance, it allows you to access region-restricted content. A lot of streaming services and online stores block or restrict their content or show you different deals depending on where in the world you're connecting from. And private internet access helps you get around this by having servers in all 50 US states and 91 other countries. It's also available on all platforms, whether that be Linux, Windows, Android, Mac, iOS, whatever. And with a single subscription, you can use it with an unlimited number of devices at the same time. It also fully supports peer-to-peer file sharing, which brings me to my personal favorite feature, which is that it's fast. They don't throttle you for torrenting or anything like that. It's also extremely affordable, and by using my personal link, you can get an 83% discount for just $2.03 a month, with 4 months free when you use my link, all with a 30-day money-back guarantee to boot. So check private internet access out. I highly recommend it. Now, before we can dive into refuting the arguments for why taxation is not theft, we first have to understand why it is theft. To be honest, it's kind of straightforward. Just the definition of theft alone makes it already a pretty solid argument. According to Britannica, at least, theft is defined as the physical removal of an object that is capable of being stolen without the consent of the owner. Or to put it really simply, it's just non-consensual possession or appropriation of property. And taxation is defined as imposition of compulsory levies on individuals or entities by governments. And compulsory is non-consensual. And the levies are that of monetary property. Basically, the government takes your money against your consent. And so right off the bat, taxation falls pretty easily within what you'd define as theft. So if you'd want to take the objective route to argue that taxation is not theft, you have to argue that either taxation is consensual, or that the money being levied doesn't count as property for some weird reason, or that theft has nothing to do with consent, which is a little bit absurd. But I'd also like to go over a slightly more interesting explanation for why taxation is theft. Let's say that you are running a charity, and just for good faith, let's give this charity a relatively noble cause. You're running a children's cancer treatment charity, and you're out canvassing for donations. Now, of course, some people are willing to donate to the cause, but of course, some people are not. Now, the simple question here, of course, is would you stick a gun to the people who are not willing to donate to your cause? Do you think you would be morally in the right to whip out a gun in the middle of the canvassing event and just say, all right, screw all you people who won't donate? Guess what? Your voluntary donation is mandatory. Seriously, would you violently, under the threat of death, force them to donate to your cause? Would you be willing to pull the trigger if they said no? I mean, obviously, this is just a hypothetical situation, but seriously, would you do it? And the reality is, if you have any inkling of common sense at all, probably not. You have no idea what these people's financial situation is. For all you know, they're already donating to something just as important, or they may just be too poor to donate. But more importantly, there's also just the simple philosophical question of, do you have the right to do that to them? The innate problem here is it's not really charity anymore if you do that, is it? even if it's for a quote-unquote noble cause, you are still saying that you know how they should spend their money better than they do. Almost as if you're trying to take ownership of their will, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense if you think about it, because you're effectively stating that you have property rights but they don't, that you have a right to the resources more than they do, which just goes to show one of the main issues with denying the fact that property rights exist. Nobody can actually make this claim without contradicting themselves. And here's the problem. That's exactly what the state does when they're taxing you. At the end of the day, the only real difference between a private company offering you a service in exchange for your voluntary resources or consent to associate with them is that the state just ignores this consent. They just say you will pay for it or else. Which brings us to our first argument against taxation being theft that needs to be refuted, which is that the state isn't literally holding a gun to your head while you're paying taxes, therefore it's not actually theft. So yeah, this is a pretty stupid argument, but it's also really strangely common, and it's one I've seen breadtube debate bros unironically use in arguments about taxation. The claim that because the IRS doesn't have an agent of the law standing right behind you with the gun in their hand, then it's not actually theft. Anyways, the flaw with this argument is that it's ignoring both the concept of time and the concept of logical conclusions. Imagine if someone tried to argue that a guy pushing a boulder down a hill, leading to that boulder destroying somebody's house, had nothing to do with the boulder destroying the house, because all he did was push the boulder, but that had nothing to do with the boulder rolling downhill, because it wasn't rolling downhill at the time that he pushed it. It's a really weird argument that just kind of ignores cause and effect. Yes, it's true that there is no government agent standing right behind you when you do your taxes holding a gun to your head, but that also does not matter, because if you refuse to pay your taxes, the feds will first find out about it and then send you nasty letters demanding that you pay your taxes. And if you don't comply, they'll send you court summons. And if you just continue to not comply, they will eventually send men to your house with guns who will then take you to jail under the threat of violence if you do not comply. Just because there's time that elapses and a series of various steps that elapse between point A and point B doesn't mean you get to ignore all obvious causal links between point A and point B. It's a really bizarre argument. Very few people are incapable of comprehending the fact that time can be a factor in causal links. It's a case of something I've called philosophical illiteracy. It's when a person thinks that if they refuse to acknowledge the logical conclusions of where something leads, then they get to pretend that those logical conclusions don't exist. Yeah, I know, we're kind of starting out with a weird argument here, but again, it's really, really common. People will actually and unironically argue that taxation is not theft because the government isn't standing there right behind you at the time you're doing your taxes. But yeah, TLDR, it is a bad argument because there is in fact such a thing as time, and there is a fact such a thing as a process. Ignoring the existence of that process doesn't magically make it go away. And this is quite possibly the most important thing that people need to understand about taxation. When someone says that there are social programs that should be funded by taxation, they are effectively saying that they believe that the programs they want funded should be funded under the violent threat of death for anybody who doesn't want to help fund them. There is no real meaningful difference between saying funded by taxation and funded by threatening violence. And sometimes when you point that out, people will then say, well, it's legal and the government has the right to do it because it's the law, so it still doesn't count. Which brings us to the next argument. Taxation is legal expropriation of resources rather than illegal expropriation of resources, therefore it is not theft. So yeah, remember at the beginning of this video I mentioned that a lot of arguments against taxation being theft are really just circular arguments? Well, this is our first one. And this one usually tends to stem from not really quite understanding what the argument that taxation is theft really is. To say that taxation is theft is generally a libertarian philosophy argument rooted in ethics. In other words, taxation is theft is an ethical argument. So it's about what society should do and what laws should be, and not so much concerned about what the law currently is. That is completely irrelevant to the argument. Arguments rooted in ethics and philosophy are about what good and evil should be. It's how we think about what the difference is and where lines are drawn. And so when someone says that taxation is not theft because taxation is legal, they are effectively stating that it's good because it's the law and it should be the law because it is good. Which is, again, just a really dumb circular argument. And just kind of talking on the subject of ethics, it's usually considered a very low level of ethical understanding to think that ethics come from the law. For example, it's considered a less mature way to look at ethics on the Kohlberg scale, and it's also considered an incoherent and subjective model just by looking at history. Governments throughout the world and throughout history have done a lot of bad things, a lot of questionable things, and all of those things were often within the scope of the law at the time they were done. With an obvious example a lot of people go to is just the Holocaust question, which I know is a bit generic, but it's an easy one that everybody knows. Because technically, at the time of the Holocaust, putting the Jews in camps was considered legal within Germany at that time. And if you want to say that the law equals good, then you are forced to concede that that was a good thing that happened. But of course, you can really just take anything that governments have done in history and see this as an example for why this is a silly way to think. For instance, a more recent example would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Technically, it is a legal thing that Russia is doing within Russian law to invade Ukraine. Does that mean invading Ukraine is a good thing? So yeah, assuming that law equals good reveals itself to be a very silly way to think about ethics if you just think about it for longer than, well, 10 seconds. Although there is a slightly less cringe version of this argument that says that just, well, taxation is not theft because might makes right. But this isn't really much better because might makes right is really just denying that ethics exists. It's just saying whoever has biggest stick gets to decide how things are, and that's the law of the jungle, and that's how it is. Which, to some degree, has truth from a realist perspective, but it isn't really true at all in terms of ethics. When you deny that ethics exists just as a way of looking at the world, just denying any kind of epistemology tied to ethics, you run into quite a few problems. First off, there's just the question of, well, why does anybody even care? If you believe ethics are not a thing, and you believe that might just makes right, then, well, you're just kind of conceding that taxation is theft, but Krug have big sticks, so it doesn't matter. So it's not really an argument against taxation being theft, but rather this is an argument against it meaning anything, which is kind of a red herring and getting off topic entirely. But for the sake of completion, I'll address it seriously anyways. The problem with might makes right, or really the problem with just saying LMAO to any kind of ethical philosophy, is that the logical conclusion of that is that nobody has any rights. And as it turns out, people generally don't like to live in any kind of society where they don't have any rights. In fact, one of the main reasons society was created was so that people could agree upon rules generally based on ethics so that the peace could be kept, rather than just a world filled with barbarians that are constantly murdering each other. So it's essentially just a naturalistic fallacy that ignores the central point. Just because the fact that the law of the jungle makes it true in nature that power does win, that doesn't make it good for social interactions. And it's certainly not a good way to get economic growth, because the thing with the barbarians constantly going at each other's throats is that a society that is filled with nothing but that doesn't really advance in modern technology very much. That's actually one of the reasons why there really wasn't much economic growth before people figured out how to have an economic system that structures society in a way that makes it so that it's not zero-sum. That is the real problem with might makes right, is that if you try to structure society around might makes right, you effectively have a zero-sum game. You have a world where one person's gain is always based on another person's loss, when in fact we have found a way to make it so that people can gain in ways that makes other people also gain. So that's just kind of the basic consequentialist argument against might makes right. And again, it doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not taxation is theft. It's just attacking the very premise of ethics existing rather than the argument itself. So let's get back on topic and move on to some other arguments for taxation not being theft. Specifically, let's move on to the just move argument. This is the argument that taxation actually is consensual because if you don't like it, you can just move out of the country. Now, first of all, this is just kind of silly because a lot of the people who will make this argument are often the bread tube types who make the exact same argument in reverse when defending people who live in bad neighborhoods because they could just move. And they'll often explain why that's not a realistic argument to tell people to just move. Not everybody's in a situation where they can just move. It's not always that simple. And it's funny because in the context of taxation, it actually makes even less sense. Because there's nowhere you can actually just move to. This is in fact one of the main problems with how the state works and how taxation works. If it was just a case where only local taxes existed and you could actually move off-grid and voluntarily disassociate yourself from society and avoid taxation that way, it wouldn't be nearly as big of a problem. It would still technically be theft until the services of the city could be privatized, but it wouldn't be nearly as big of an issue in the way that property rights currently work within how states operate. You see, the problem with states around the world is that they don't really properly homestead their land at all. What they do instead is they just kind of arbitrarily claim that they own all the land to the degree that they can get away with, at least until they run into the claims of another state. So you can't just move 100 miles into the woods or something and create some kind of off-grid, self-sustaining farm, and the state will still hunt you down and force you to pay taxes. There's really nowhere you can go on this planet. Even in near inhospitable regions like the Canadian Canadian tundra. The Canadian government will still find a way to make you owe taxes. So not only is just move an inane argument, it's also not even correct. You cannot avoid taxes by just moving. And in some cases, the state actually still considers you to be their property to some degree. For instance, let's say you buy a private island in the Cayman Islands, but you're a United States citizen. The US government actually still requires you to file a US tax return. Just look what it says on the IRS.gov. General facts. I'm a US citizen living and working outside of the United States for many years. Do I still need to file a US tax return? Yes, if you are a US citizen or a resident alien living outside the United States, your worldwide income is subject to US income tax, regardless of where you live. So you legitimately can't just move. Which then brings us to a somewhat related argument, the social contract theory. Or in other words, taxation isn't theft because we live in a society, which has kind of an obvious issue, which is that the social contract is something you would have to consent to. And the entire problem is that you cannot not consent to the social contract, because governments have not actually followed any ethical concept of homesteading when it comes to owning land. So they're just kind of claiming that you're a part of their society and owe them taxation because you just are. It is, in fact, actually just another circular argument. And it's also just kind of a specific flawed argument that I like to refer to as kicking the can. It's when people just kind of kick the problem down to a different concept that has exactly the same problem and pretend that they fixed the problem. In this case, they're kicking the can of taxation being theft to avoid the conversation about taxation not being consensual to the social contract. Except the problem is you don't really have a way of getting out of the social contract either, because again, the state just claims they own everything, including you and all the land, and there's really no way you can get out of it. So it's still non-consensual, and so no valid point has actually been made here. For example, a common part of the argument for the social contract theory comes down to arguing for public goods. Or in other words, taxation is not theft because my public goods. And the issue here is, what exactly is a public good? What if you don't want to use the public good? For instance, let's say that there's a street and a lamppost, but you don't ever want to use it. Is it still a public good? Do you still have to pay for it? This just kind of brings us back to our earlier problem. You can't actually just move out of taxation. You can't just go out and create a private society out in the woods to avoid taxes. The state will still assume that you owe taxes. So there needs to be a way to actually get out of the contract and disassociate yourself from the so-called public good, or else the claim that it's consensual falls apart. It also just kind of brings a weird question to the whole public good question, because there are cases of private things funded by somebody else that they allow others to use. It is entirely possible to make a good that is available to everybody for free without demanding that everybody also have to pay for it. So in many ways, it's also a false dichotomy fallacy. Making something available to all doesn't mean that all have to pay for it. People can voluntarily make something and give it away for free. It's called charity. So anyway, let's move on to a similar argument, which is that taxation isn't theft because voting. This is the idea that people vote for the taxes and you have the chance to vote for it or against it, and therefore it is not theft. Now, this is another silly one because majority rules in no way imply consent. For instance, if the majority of people in a society agreed to murder and torture somebody for funsies, that doesn't magically change the fact that it's still murder and torture. And at this point, I kind of have to point out one of the weird things about taxation, which is that people who think taxation isn't theft have accepted some really bizarre arguments in favor of taxation that, if you think about it, we would never ever accept for just about anything else. If you were kidnapped and forced into some kind of weird twisted game where everybody in a room, including you, votes for who's going to die, and they vote for you to die, does that mean you consent to your own death? And remember, we've already gone over the argument that you can't just move out of it, so this isn't a false comparison in any way. And the answer, of course, is that no way, you wouldn't see that as something that you've consented to. And that's just kind of the weird thing about trying to avoid admitting that taxation is theft. People have adopted just bizarre arguments that nobody would ever accept in any other context. For example, here's another one. Taxation is not theft because you have to engage in some kind of voluntary interaction before you get taxed. So yes, it's true when it comes to things like income tax or property tax or sales tax, it is true that you indeed have to consent to selling something or trading something in order for the taxation to occur. It is true that there is in fact no living tax. If you just kind of stand there and don't do anything, you don't really incur much in taxation. You will also eventually die, but yeah, that's besides the point. Of course, the problem with this argument is that it is again something that we would never accept for any other context. For example, if someone were to rob you and say, hey, stop right there, give me your wallet, or else I will pull the trigger and shoot you, does the act of you refusing to give them your wallet mean that you consent to being shot? No, of course not. That is completely ridiculous. And the reason it's not is very simple. The flaw in the reasoning here lies in the fact that consent to X does not imply consent to Y. If you consent to trade some silver for a box of somebody else's apples, you aren't consenting to anybody coming in and stealing some extra silver out of the deal, for the same reason you are not consenting to somebody unleashing a bunch of bees on you and stinging you after you are done with this transaction. transaction. It's actually kind of a really silly argument. And so this idea that you automatically consent to having part of your income stolen by virtue of you consenting to go out and earn income in the first place makes very little sense. If a robber were to come up to you when you were depositing your pay stub and then demand that you give him half of your income, absolutely nobody would argue that that is not theft because you voluntarily decided to earn money in the first place. And yet, for some strange reason, when it comes to the state, people unironically make this exact same argument. It's completely baffling. But anyway, let's move on to some slightly better arguments that people tend to have a bit more difficulty dealing with. So let's start out with one that's common with Republicans. Taxation is only theft when you get nothing out of it. So this argument states that when the government takes your money in the form of taxation and then wastes it on stupid stuff, like for example the Biden administration funding equity programs that don't actually help and are in fact quite harmful, then that counts as theft. But when the taxes are used to fund something like, say, the police force and keeping the peace, then taxes are not theft. This is a somewhat better argument against taxation as theft because it's at least acknowledging that taxes can be theft. It is an acknowledgement of the fact that the government takes your money and they spend some of it on stuff that you would want and some of it on stuff that you don't want. And when they spend it on stuff that you don't want, well, that's obviously significantly more annoying and a much bigger waste of your resources. However, there are still problems with this argument. The first is just kind of going back to how theft is defined. Theft really, again, just means relieving property from somebody without their consent. So for instance, if someone were to steal $1,000 from you, but then leave the absolute most delicious cake you've ever tasted in your life on your doorstep, that doesn't change the fact that the act of them taking the $1,000 away from you is still theft. And no matter how delicious that cake is, well, maybe you didn't want it. Maybe after eating the cake you feel to yourself that, well, that was good, but it was only worth $100. Which just immediately brings up the question, isn't the market superior for these kind of decisions? Rather than being randomly stolen from and randomly given cake, why not just have a free market so that there can be a cake shop for people to buy cakes? And that most delicious cake will probably be the most expensive cake, and if you want it, you can voluntarily consent to buying it. And that's the root of the issue here. Saying that you sometimes get things out of taxation doesn't change the fact that it's still theft. It just feels less bad when you get something in return. But the reality is, if you got to choose which government services you pay for, you'd probably find yourself spending a lot less. Which brings me to a very important point that is a bit of a tangent but needs to be said, which is that a lot of people don't understand just how much money the government wastes. A lot of people think that most of their tax dollars goes to the roads or other infrastructure or whatever, but this is actually not true. Much of your tax dollars actually just goes into the pockets of bureaucrats, or is just in general wasted by inefficient spending compared to the private sector. You see, the problem with projects in the private sector in comparison to projects from the government is that the government doesn't really have a profit incentive, because the government can get just as much money as they need from, again, their ability to take money without your consent, which means they get to consume resources without actually being held accountable to those resources, as opposed to the private sector, which has an incentive to keep costs low because people have to actually consent to funding their project. And if they waste that money, then, well, people will stop funding them. This results in something that is sometimes known as the bureaucratic rule of two, which is that a government project will almost always cost at least twice as much as the same project done by the private sector. This is a rule that has been discussed at length and repeatedly proven, both in empirical studies and just in rational terms. In fact, on the rational side of things, such as from the Mises Institute, there's pretty solid reasoning to suggest that it is even worse than this. For instance, in one article from Gary Gow's, Why the Cost of Government is Higher Than You Think. Mainly the problem of crowding out effects and how it disincentivizes private investment. So for example, a lot of tax dollars that go into Social Security could have actually gone into investing, and thus would have even better returns than what you would already normally expect from the bureaucratic rule of two. So when a public servant comes out and promises a new government plan or new welfare program that is supposed to be for you, this always ignores the economic reality that you could have gotten something better for cheaper if you had just gone out and bought it for or invested in it for yourself. And so even when the taxes are paying for something that you would want, you're actually losing out in the long run. And this is again something that has been proven. The vast majority of people, if you were to just take what you were taxed on in terms of Social Security, and you had invested it in something safe like the Dow Jones or something, you would actually come out with more money over the same amount of time, which was proven in an analysis from Michael Tanner back in 2012, along with showing the fact that Social Security in the way it's currently being operated isn't sustainable at all, which means that Social Security is actually very risky right now. But anyway, let's shift to a different argument against taxation being theft entirely. One used a bit more by lefties, the equity argument. This is the argument that taxation is a form of collective justice. You can find examples of it on places like the Tax Justice Network, and it's effectively the idea that people don't actually have the right to their pre-tax income because people's incomes are not morally just. And the reason they're not perfectly just is because, well, they aren't equal. So in other words, the root of this argument is claiming that equality equals justice. Certain jobs don't earn as much, and that's not equality, that's not justice. Now, aside from just the fact that this is just a very pseudo-intellectual way of saying, wah, that's not fair. On a serious note, there's a lot of problems with this. First off, it's just the equity fallacy. The assumption that unequal outcomes are as a result of unfair treatment or some kind of unjust thing happening is a demonstrably false assumption. I've pointed out why it's false before. It was one of the first videos I actually put serious effort into making on my channel, because it's something that needs to be referenced a lot when refuting a lot of these takes, as these wah, it's not fair takes are based on a demonstrably false foundation. There is a small nugget of truth to it. It may seem at times that the market is not fair. There are definitely some cringy things, like for example the fact that OnlyFans models tend to earn more money than construction workers, even though construction workers earn a living by making the world a better place as opposed to making it a worse place. However, these problems at the root are just flaws with humanity. Human beings aren't perfect, but the fact is they are who we are. And the thing is, most of the time the free market actually gets it correct. For instance, people who develop new technologies that make the world a better place tend to earn more money than fast food workers, who earn minimum wage by making people fat. It's easy to look at the dark side of humanity and say, oh hey, that results in something that isn't fair. But beyond that, it's also coming with a very simple fallacy of assuming that the government would somehow make it more fair. The government is still going to be staffed by human beings who come with the same flaws. And so there's still going to be a dark side to that government. In fact, it's worse because the government has less incentive to use those resources in ways that makes financial sense, because again, the government gets to fund themselves through a non-voluntary exchange. And so what happens is people will keep voting for more big government to fix this equality problem, which honestly isn't even a real problem, as inequality can be a good thing. What actually happens instead is that the government just gets bigger and more corrupt, and then the inequality doesn't really get fixed. In fact, countries that have a free market tend to have, interestingly enough, more equality and more economic growth than countries that don't. Brings you to an old quote from economist Milton Friedman: a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. And the reason this happens is just the economic reality of negative freedom and positive freedom. People who try to focus on equality first don't understand that positive freedom is just the benefits of wealth that you get from negative freedom. And beyond that, there's just another problem with trying to see a moral system as viewing justice as equality, other than the fact that it's a subjective moral system. If you were to push this to its logical conclusion, you just get Marxism, because you then just have the obvious question of where do you stop at equality? People obviously are not equal. People do not produce at the same rate, cultures do not produce at the same rate, so at what point does forcing equality stop? If you look at history, you'll find out that trying to force equality doesn't actually work. It just causes society to break down. So even if we were to ignore natural law theory, which is the ethical system that libertarians tend to use, and we were to instead go by consequentialism, even from a consequentialist perspective, this still would not be a good justification for taxation. And this discussion just immediately brings us to the more openly Marxist argument, which is that property is theft, or the collectivist argument. This is the argument that taxation is just the people regaining what is rightfully theirs, as the essence of claiming property steals it from other people, that you thus don't really own anything, or a more charitable way to put it is that you owe taxes back to the people because your wealth depends on them. For example, someone might say that a trucking company depends on the roads for them to make their wealth, and therefore the CEO of that company owes a portion of his money back to society, as well as the truckers working for him, because society pays for the roads. So yeah, now we're kind of getting into, but who will build the roads? My roads! Oh my god, without taxation there'll be no roads. Now first off, this actually runs into a very similar problem with the argument that claims that taxation is only theft when you aren't benefiting from it. It's true that the trucker company is benefiting from the existence of the roads, but they didn't consent for the roads to be built by taxation, did they? So it's still theft. And also, one thing a lot of people don't know when they often bring up the whole roads argument against libertarians is that the roads are actually already built by private companies. It's just that the government funds those private companies. They just bid it out to private contractors for who will build and maintain the roads. And so you could come up with an exact same similar system that could be done privately through crowdfunding. And again, Again, going back to the bureaucratic rule of two, it would actually cost less. So yeah, in case you were wondering why the Rhodes argument isn't actually a good argument, now you know. But yeah, it doesn't really make sense to try and hold someone accountable to something they didn't consent to. And the second problem is that the idea that property is theft has a very big problem where it creates a moral system that necessitates the creation of conflict. For example, let's kind of go back to one of the earlier arguments I covered. How you can't really just go off into the woods and homestead some land and live off of it. The government still tries to tax you. Because that also serves as a really good example as to why this argument is invalid. Now, homesteading is a little bit complex, so let me just simplify it a bit. The basic concept of it is first come, first serve. So say someone goes into the woods and creates this little off-grid self-sustaining farm. It's 1 acre of land, and it's actually kind of interesting. It's something you can look up on the internet if you're curious about it, how it's possible to create sort of a self-sustaining small farm on 1 acre. It's kind of fascinating, really, and it's also just a really good example of basic homesteading. So say someone has gone off 100 miles into the forest and they've built this off of land that nobody else was using. Under the principle of homesteading, this person has done nothing wrong because, hey, first come, first serve. They've just used land that nobody else is using. And if you were to disagree with that, you're just causing conflict with that person for no reason, which is exactly what saying property is theft leads you to. When you say property is theft, the idea that a person using land isn't valid unless everybody else agrees to it, that means in order for someone to live on land, everyone must first agree and bicker amongst each other about how that land is going to be used. And as history has proven, bicker they absolutely will do. It would be like if you tried to argue that people do not have bodily autonomy, and thus do not own their own actions. That would mean that people cannot act unless everybody else agrees that they can act. Aside from just the logical problem that this technically runs into an issue where nobody can act, even if we ignore that, it would just mean that everybody has to argue with each other before anybody can do anything. That's not a real moral system. It's a very hard sale to say that an ethical model that demands constant conflict is an effective ethical model, especially not one for society at large. The reality is the guy who's effed off in the woods and has created his little 1 acre homestead and is sustaining himself off of it is not really harming anybody else, nor is he using anything of anybody else's. So why should he be taxed? And that's when you realize that's all the collectivist argument really leads us to. There's no such thing as the collective, it's just lots and lots of individual people. And so when you try to make the collectivist argument, all you're really doing is just justifying those people arguing with each other endlessly about who owns what. Whereas if you just follow the principles of homesteading, you would then have an objective system to decide who is creating the conflict and who is not. There needs to be a rightful owner, or else you can't have conflict resolution. This is why communism in practice has always been the quote-unquote so-called collective fighting amongst each other, until the logical conclusion of that, a totalitarian dictatorship, ends up being achieved. Yeah, funny how that goes. The collectivist argument ends up with just one guy owning everything. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And when you understand things from a rational perspective, it becomes obvious why this keeps happening. People need to occupy somewhere in space to exist. Two people cannot occupy the exact same space at the exact same time. When you try to claim the space of another, that creates conflict. When you try to argue that this is theft and that the collective must thus bicker amongst themselves, you are just going to incentivize constant conflict until one guy has enough power that nobody's willing to stand up against him. Or if that all sounds a bit too complicated, TLDR, communism doesn't work. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into one that's a bit more common, which is the utilitarian argument, or the argument that taxation is necessary for society to function. Now, the first problem with this argument is it's not actually contesting the fact that taxation is theft. A common philosophical hypothetical that is used to explain this is a mystical, futuristic, utopian city that is able to exist through a system or device that creates prosperity for the society by constantly torturing a single child. It comes from a short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, and it was also somewhat recently showcased in an episode of Star Trek Discovery. And the basic problem it shows is that even though, yes, this society is able to thrive off of the torture of a single child, that doesn't change the fact that they are torturing a child. That's just the basic issue with the utilitarian form of argument. It doesn't really contest what is being said, which then just kind of warps you to the obvious point: wouldn't it be better if a city is able to exist and prosper without torturing a child? At which point the utilitarian is then forced to concede that, yes, okay, maybe there's something a little bit more to ethics than just utilitarianism. They're forced to concede that utilitarianism is inherently subjective. And the thing is, just like the children of Omelas don't really enjoy being tormented, there are a lot of people who do not enjoy taxation. There are people who would walk away from Omelas, which brings up the immediate question of why are we not allowed to do so? And thus the utilitarian is forced by his own reasoning to concede that the good outcome without violating people's rights is better, and therefore concedes that those rights exist and they do matter. And this means that the utilitarian argument is not really meaningfully different from the next argument, which is the minarchist argument, or that taxation is a necessary evil. And the thing is, this argument doesn't really matter because once you've reached this point, you've already agreed that taxation is theft. You've already accepted the basic libertarian premise against taxation as true. Thus, the logic follows that taxation is a wrong that must be reduced as much as possible, regardless of whether or not you think it's needed for society to exist. Because there's this common problem I see with a lot of conservatives who know that the government is too big and very corrupt, and that we should return to a more fiscally responsible position of less government that isn't incurring tens of trillions of dollars in debt, is that a lot of them just shy away from conceding that taxation is theft because they don't want to come across as an anti-government nut. But this is strange because the reality is all the evidence shows that much of what the government does is inefficient and stupid. And so the real question is, why is everybody such a pro-government nut? And why should we feel the need to constantly defend the state and the non-voluntary nature of how they are funded? Because there's this certain weird fallacy that people have all fallen into where it is assumed that a problem can only be fixed by the government, and then the burden of proof is shifted onto the libertarian to prove otherwise. For example, going back to roads. The standard argument is always, of course, that without the government, there will be no roads, because no one would fund the roads. And as I'd explained earlier, you can just have private companies build roads through crowdfunding. But the real question is, why is it that the libertarians are the ones who always have to explain that? Really, the burden of proof should be on the statist to explain why they think it's impossible for something to exist without government. Because there's this inherently strange issue in nearly every argument that comes from this. They're effectively always stating that society needs X to function, but also stating that no one would fund X voluntarily. But if X really is needed for society, then that means the default position that makes most sense is that people would fund it. And so really the onus should be on them to explain why they believe that people are just too stupid to fund basic things like healthcare and infrastructure on their own, without having someone hold a gun to their head and force them to do it. Especially since people have funded these things voluntarily in the past. Even things like social safety nets like welfare have been funded by mutual aid societies in the past, and people already pay for private insurance in order to fund their healthcare. But most importantly, none of these arguments prove that taxation is not theft. Even if you do believe that people are too dumb to fund certain things by their own volition, you still have to acknowledge that it is theft. And when you take a step back and you see all the problems in the world that are constantly being caused by a lot of unaccountable state bureaucrats, we have reached a point where we need to stop giving them the benefit of a doubt, and we need to recognize that the burden of proof should really be on them to justify their existence. Anyways, that is all. Please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for the algorithm, and if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or buying some merch, or again, checking out private internet access. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time.